next panelist is the president of the the chair, sorry, of the Canadian Federation of Students of Ontario. And I would be remiss if I didn't say thank you to the Canadian Federation of Students during the CAT support recent labor dispute, because they were tremendously supportive and helpful, so thank you. So without further ado, Sandy Hudson.
Okay, so thanks for having me today. I'm going to try to be really candid because I'm a pretty frustrated recent grad who's in a lot of debt and I'm particularly frustrated at the current government. So I have a lot to say. I'm going to try to make it make sense so that folks understand. But just to note that we've created through our campaign called the Take It Over campaign these materials which I put on the back. It's a report card of all the parties and how they're doing for post-secondary education. So I'll start off by saying that the Progressive Conservatives have a D here, and that's because we're being really nice to them. They have absolutely no strategy. I have no idea what's going on there. We even met with them after we gave them this mark, and they were like, well, you gotta give us a better mark. And we're like, why? Because we really care about education. You have to say something more than that. You can't just say we really care. And they had nothing for us, so they said, well, we'll fully fund the spaces that we promised. Oh, great, thanks. You're gonna get a D. Beyond that, beyond the Progressive Conservatives, I really and truly don't understand the strategy of the incumbents, the Liberal Party, and I'll get more into that later, but essentially they have also no long-term vision for post-secondary education, and it seems like, and I would guess that this is the case in a number of sectors, that all they're looking at is trying to get reelected. They don't care. It doesn't seem like they care about what happens next, because I'll get into their strategy a little bit into my speak, but it just doesn't really make any sense at all, because anyone can see is that what's happening is that yes, the Progressive Conservatives created a huge problem in the 90s for post-secondary education. And then the Liberals came in and they didn't fix it. They put a whole bunch of Band-Aids on it and then increased the problem under their power. And then now all they're promising us is more Band-Aids that won't solve the root problem of what's happening in post-secondary education. So what's happening in post-secondary education? In Ontario, we have the highest tuition fees in Canada. So that means that students are paying $6,600 on average for 1 year of post-secondary education, but those fees can go as high as $30,000 for an undergraduate dentistry degree. So it really depends on what program you're in. The average debt for students in Ontario is $37,000, taking into account both public and private forms of debt, and that sounds right to me because I'm right at $35,000. And what does this mean? It means that we've created a post-secondary education system in this province which is saying to students that we will admit you based on your pocketbooks. We don't really care about how well you're going to do or your desire to do the work or what we even need in our society to grow and be socially healthy. What we care about is how much money you can give to fund these institutions. And it's really leaving a lot of students behind. And for those students who can get through, I'll give you a personal story for myself. I'm getting a lot in debt, which means that later on in my life I can expect to pay more for my post-secondary education than the person who sat next to me who's wealthy. Why? Because I'm too poor to afford post-secondary education. So that makes a lot of sense, right? And the other thing is, at the height of it, I was working 3 jobs, one of them one of those shady jobs that Tina just spoke about, at the same time as pursuing a full-time post-secondary education. So I can tell you that it's very, very difficult to attend class when you're having to worry about whether or not you're going to be able to afford the 3 different transit fares that you're going to have to pay when you're coming down from Brampton. It's impossible. Plus, you got to work out those 3 jobs that you're doing. You're missing class all the time. The students who are wealthy, of course, once you get into graduate education and professional education, you see that the more wealthier students tend to be in school for longer because, well, they've had more opportunity to do well because they weren't working those 3 jobs. My marks weren't great. I don't know if I'll be able to get into grad school. It's because I was working the entire time that I was in school, and that's the reality for a lot of students. So, in addition to that, so we have, the Liberal Party comes in, and they start to make a whole bunch of measures to try to help students when it comes to post-secondary education. So OSAP is the loan system, the student loan system in this province, and the way that it works is that in order to get a loan, you're not allowed to work more than a certain amount of hours a week. But of course you have to work because you can't afford your post-secondary education. And so one of the things that the province is doing is they're saying, well, we're not sure if all these student aid measures are actually necessary because not many students are taking them. And we don't know why low-income students aren't taking them. Maybe it's because they don't know about it. No, we're not taking them because your system is ridiculous. It doesn't allow us to make use of it. It's absolutely ridiculous the types of measures that they've come forward with, and sometimes even insulting. They also introduced this textbook grant that they were going to give to all students. Every student will be able to pay for their textbooks by getting this $300 grant. Well, I can tell you that textbooks at post-secondary in school doesn't cost less than $300, and then they have that to $150 afterwards, saying, well, not many students applied for this grant that they didn't know they were going to have to apply for. So that was also absolutely ridiculous. So what does this mean in a broader sense when first of all, we have an inequitable post-secondary education system where students from low-income backgrounds, and that's a lot racialized students with disabilities, Aboriginal students, all from these classes of society aren't able to make it to post-secondary education as much as folks who don't have those, who aren't from those communities. But in addition, the Liberals have been underfunding post-secondary education. Now that did start with the Progressive Conservatives. They cut a lot, but when the Liberals have been putting money into post-secondary education, again, it's not about strategy. It's about getting elected, and it's about how many photos they can take, because the money that they're putting into post-secondary education is going to fancy new buildings on campus. It's not going into hiring new professors or making sure that students have access to more teachers. And that's why we see more and more of these strikes, because they're no longer hiring professors and lecturers on a full-time basis. We have classrooms where our teachers are cutting class by half an hour or an hour because they need to drive up to Hamilton to get to their next teaching job, because there's no money to fund this system. It's absolutely ridiculous. So I guess since I only have a minute left, I'm just going to talk just briefly to say that the politicians who are in place right now have the benefit of studying under a highly subsidized system, and they're taking that away from the youth of today. And we hear many comparisons to the United States about how, at least we're not as bad as the United States. And yes, we can continue to compare ourselves to the worst education system in the world and think that we're doing all right. But if we compare ourselves to the rest of the world, we'll know that our post-secondary education system is bottom rung. It is one of the worst, and that's nothing to be proud of. And so what has been promised this election, just so folks know, and you can take a look at that report card to get more information, the Progressive Conservatives are promising us xenophobia and by saying that no more money to international students. We're going to take that $30 million in pocket change and put it into our own. Thank you, racists. Also, we have the McGuinty government, who seems, or a party who seems to be buying votes from students by saying that they're going to reduce tuition fees by 30%. So if you've heard this promise, I'm happy to tell you that it's a lie, that they've been touting over and over and over again, and I'm so frustrated because over the last 2 weeks all I've been doing is correcting media outlets and students all over the place who think that they're going to get 30% off their tuition fees. It's only a $1,600 grant that they're giving, which is not 30% of tuition fees. They've decided not to use Stats Canada numbers. They've made up their own because they don't believe in Stats Canada. And I don't know. Yeah, it sounds like Harper. There's the $1,600 grant, which has so many restrictions on it that 2/3 of college students will not be eligible to receive it, and they don't know that. You're not allowed to be dependent on your parents to receive the grant. You're not allowed to be in a professional program, so social work, nursing, teaching, some of the most expensive programs, not eligible for the grant. But all they're saying is 30% off tuition. They have these flyers that they're giving out at institutions where we just have to keep telling students, oh, you're not eligible for that, you're not eligible for that. So all they're trying to do is buy votes, and that's really frustrating. The NDP has promised a tuition fee freeze, which is something that's good. We're happy to hear. We'd like to hear about a rollback. There's still time to change that policy. But they're promising a freeze in tuition fees. And so I hope I've given you a sense of how frustrated students are in this province that we've been ignored, and how ridiculous our post-secondary education system is.
Well, our next presenter is no stranger to the labor movement and no stranger to the community by any stretch of the imagination. And I've done a lot of fantastic work with her, both from a community perspective and a political perspective. Carol Eve.
Thank you, Nancy. Thank you, and welcome to our hall. I'm very pleased to be here. And sisters and brothers, as we've been hearing through the varying panelists who've spoken before me, corporations and governments around the world are launching massive attacks on working people in the poor. And they're telling us that we're all in this together, and that the measures that they're implementing are necessary to keep governments from going bankrupt and keep corporations competitive. But it's not simply a question of cost trimming, cutting deficits, or bringing budgets into line. They want to use this opportunity to fundamentally change the nature of society and the role of government. And the question that's being posed for all of us is why we, people, working people, particularly women, racialized communities, should pay the cost when we did nothing to cause the crisis that's before us. Why aren't they clamping down on businesses that have been breaking the law, using financial loopholes, continuing to make profits, giving massive bonuses to upper management? Why not nationalize banks, corporations? Why not bring the profits into the public realm? We know the answer is that the attacks are not a pragmatic response to an economic crisis, but the implementation of an economic ideology intended to serve the wealthy and bring increased suffering and dislocation to working people and the poor. And John Cartwright talked about the creating crisis, making crisis. And the corporations, the governments, are also gambling that the anger that people feel can be contained. We know that there's opposition to the attacks, but we've seen in this country that the resistance is not automatic. Working people and the poor remain caught between fear and anger, wanting to fight, but feeling a pessimism about whether we can win or not. We certainly saw that in the Tea Party votes a year ago in the United States. We saw it in the vote for Ford a year ago, October, here in the city of Toronto, where voters endorsed a right-wing mayor and the simplistic message of stop the gravy train, because he went on about elites at City Hall, waste, higher taxes. And it resonated with people who are scared of what the future might bring, fearful for their jobs and their ability to make ends meet, and being offered, they felt, no real alternative. Now, if you look at what's been going on, changes in the lives of ordinary Canadians over the last 30 years have swept away all kinds of certainties, a process that's been really accelerated by the recession. And this fear of the precariousness, the instability in their lives, I mean, people feel it and they react. Immigrants come to this country with hopes of a better life, and they face systemic racism, a growing gap between rich and poor. I mean, we've lost in the steelworkers and many other industrial unions 100,000 manufacturing jobs just in the GTA alone. And prosperity for those who work hard, which used to be the foundation of the American or the Canadian dream, it's in tatters as governments rescue the rich. And the polarization of conditions, politics is likely to continue as more and more people, are alienated. And this austerity agenda, as people are saying, is being implemented worldwide. It's not just here, but our local manifestation is equally as harsh in its attacks on public services and the unions. And in response to any crisis, the champions of this neoliberalism, or whatever you may want to call it, they have a ready-made response. Shrink public programs and governments, cutting privatized public services, sell public assets, weaken the public's ability to regulate corporations, and of course attack workers and unions, and shift the cost of the crisis from the corporations and the wealthy to working people and the poor by cutting the corporate taxes, sound familiar? Increasing user fees, withdrawing from key areas of responsibility so people will have to buy services from private companies. And of course, reducing workers' wages by gutting labor laws, weakening unions, contracting out jobs, increasing precarious work, reducing employment standards if they're able. And if you contrast the treatment of working people who are losing their jobs, their homes, their unions, to the treatment of those who are actually responsible for the financial meltdown, it's extraordinary. And you know, you see that in the Ford approach. I mean, we don't have to go through it. The taking away the right to strike, the Amalgamated Transit Union, you know, Liberals in the Queen's Park going right along with it, the Board of Toronto Community Housing, all the cuts that are on the table that we're fighting right now, all of that. And the issue, as other people have said, is whether we, in unions, the unorganized, the poor, our allies, can we stop what's happening and can we build the resistance necessary? And I think in many senses the neoliberals all over the world are testing the waters. How far can they go? How much will people fight back? And they've gambled that the mass of the population will accept the attacks. But I think we're seeing worldwide that's not the case. Not that they're winning, but not that we are winning, but we are seeing, they haven't won yet either, but in Greece, in Chile, in China, in Ireland, in France, all over the world, people are fighting back, and even in the United States, you know, even in the United States, in Wisconsin and other states, and this is incredibly, incredibly important. And who will win and who will lose is really a big, big question. It's an open question. But we know, we look at history, we know we have the potential to fight back, but only if we're organized to do so. And I think one of the things that Miles had asked me to talk about is the importance of the industrial sector, the manufacturing unions, fighting alongside with public sector unions. And this is absolutely critical. And also bringing together the people who provide the services with those who use the services. I mean, we're never going to win unless we can do that. And I think that looking south of the border at Wisconsin and other places of that nature, right-wing governments came in, the anti-union, the legislation they put forward, you've all seen what happened in Wisconsin. Well, the second largest union in the state of Wisconsin was the United Steelworkers, the largest AFSCME. And what happened and what allowed that victory to take place, our members were decimated by plant closures, layoffs, huge layoffs, people who worked for generations in plants like Harley-Davidson and others. And the same politics of envy was used by the Tea Party. Why should these fat cat public sector workers have these, you know, these pensions? You know, you guys have been robbed of everything, and they had. So they got the vote. They got the vote from many of our members. But we realized, and many others realized, that that had to be turned around. And we fought very hard to turn it around. And part of it was what you saw when that state house was occupied down there, when public sector workers, farmers, private sector workers, laid off workers, teachers came together. Incredibly, incredibly important. And in other of the big industrial states like Ohio, Indiana, we've seen similar fightbacks. In Ohio, which used to be a huge steelworker state, we've had, I mean, Youngstown used to be a steel town. It's not anymore. I mean, everything is closed down, shut up. But the right-wing governor in Ohio, who put even worse legislation in place than what happened in Wisconsin, he wouldn't talk to the unions, he wouldn't talk to the communities, he wouldn't talk to the racialized groups who said, you can't do this to us, the services, the job cuts, etc. Wouldn't talk, he didn't care. But in that state and other states, we don't have it here, you can recall a piece of legislation passed if you get enough votes. They needed something like 300,000 votes. They got 1.3 million, not votes, signatures on a petition. 1.3 million signatures on a petition. There's a group called We Are Ohio formed of unions, faith groups, racialized communities, students, came together and said, we're going to take back our state. And they went door to door, they went to churches, they went to community centers, they went to union halls, 1.3 million signatures. And everyone who signed understood that they were involved in a war for what they believed in and the type of state they wanted to live in. And they were able to do it. Now that's coming up in November on the referendum, and there is no doubt from what they're saying is the polls now are something like 59% against that bill, 23% for. They've turned around in a year what looked like a total disaster for working people and the poor. So what it says to me is this is possible. And I think the fights that we're involved in here, whether it's, you know, against Ford, against Hudak, against McGinty, whoever, I mean, they're provincial, Harper, I mean, they're all three sides of the same coin. They're the same enemy we're up against. And I think for absolute sure in our union, We were trying so hard. We had people down sitting in the city hall chambers the other day. We did the last city council as well. We are totally committed. And that wonderful video that people saw as a build-up and was performed, you know, we're going to be going into, we hope, if we can do it, into workplaces all over Toronto and showing it, the half-hour lunch break, do a 20-minute little module to show what's going on and why it's so important that our members understand what this fight is about. It's not their jobs, it's your jobs, but it's their services, and in the end, it's all of our jobs. So the intensity of this struggle is very real. The importance of industrial workers coming together with public sector workers, with precarious workers, with community members who use those services is critical. And if we do it right, I think we can push it back and win. So thank you very much.